welcome to the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. And of course, welcome to the 2025 lecture series, Watson's World, A Legacy Unfolds, an introduction to the life, work, and contributions of the late Karl Stewart Watson. Our speaker this evening is Professor Emerita Julia Horrocks, and she will be speaking to us about Watson and natural heritage. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to hearing about that. Julia Horrocks is an emerita professor in the Department of Biological and Chemical Sciences at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus. She came to Barbados in 1979 on a study and serve scholarship and earned her PhD in the behavioral ecology of the Barbados green monkey in 1984. Following postdoctoral study at McGill University, which she spent at Bellairs Research Institute in Barbados, she became interested in the biology and conservation of endangered sea turtles and became the wider Caribbean Sea Turtle Network's WIDECAST country coordinator for Barbados and director of the newly formed Barbados Sea Turtle Project. In 2001, she was awarded the Certificate of Merit in the Governor General's Environmental Awards Program for her sea turtle conservation work. And in 2004, she was awarded a Pew Marine Conservation Fellowship. She became a professor in 2006 and has authored dozens of books, technical reports, and scientific articles, primarily on green monkeys and sea turtles. She is currently the coordinator of WIDECAST Caribbean Marine Turtle Tagging Center and represents the islands of the Caribbean, Netherlands on the Scientific Committee for the Inter-American Convention for the Protection and Conservation of Sea Turtles. She is the chair of the CITES Scientific Authority and the Biodiversity Working Group of the Ministry of Environment and National Beautification Green and Blue Economy. Ladies and gentlemen, a very warm welcome to Professor Emerita Julia Horrocks, who I am sure is going to have a wonderful and exciting program for us this evening. I think this is going to be my favorite one for the series. I say this only 2 lectures in. My colleagues know that I'm a bit of a closet environmentalist. And of course, we're championing having the museum as a climate action hub for young people. So this is going to be a near and dear one to my heart. Welcome, Professor Horrocks.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you for coming out to this presentation. I'm very pleased to have been invited to talk about my dear friend and colleague, Karl Watson, and specifically his contributions to natural heritage in Barbados. He's very well known for his expertise in history and archaeology, but he also made significant contributions to natural heritage conservation, both in his personal capacity. He's very active on social media, for example, in his lectures and his field trips, as well as the bird expert on the CITES and biodiversity committees. He was an educator first and foremost, who enjoyed sharing his knowledge of nature to inspire people to care and conserve. He was articulate and witty, but erudite too. He had a real way with words. And so with the permission of his family, I will be including some of the posts that he made on his Facebook page, because very often he could say things better than I could say them. So, well, what is natural heritage? Basically, it's the natural environment inherited from past generations, maintained in the present, so that it can be bestowed or passed on to future generations. And the term actually comes from natural inheritance. And really it predates the more common term that we use these days, which is biodiversity, to describe all living things. Of course, Karl was interested in the natural heritage of past generations of Barbadians, which was depleted greatly following colonization. But he was especially interested in ensuring that the remaining natural heritage in Barbados would be passed on to future generations. Karl was a naturalist, so he wasn't a biologist. He didn't study animals and plants in books or at university, but he learned by observing relationships between trees, birds, insects, etc. He grew up in the Bayland, spent a lot of time at Browns Beach and Burke's Beach, at the spring, on the bay pasture, and in the mangroves at Brighton. In the 2008 volume of the Museum Journal, he spoke of his fascination and curiosity about nature as a child. And he was spurred on by his mother, in fact, who had a great love for all animals except lizards. She had pet toads, pet crabs, tortoises, rats, you name it. And no doubt Karl inherited some of that love for nature from his mother. Karl, you may, if you follow him on Facebook, you may know that he loves everything, including centipedes, which often gives people a little bit of a, they're a little bit shocked by that. The spark of appreciation for birds was kindled into a flame by his history teacher at Harrison College, Captain Maurice Hutt, and Hutt's wife, Hazel. In addition to inspiring Karl with a love of history, Karl also spoke fondly of bird-watching trips with the Hutts. While his peers were going to the cinema and watching cowboy films, I've been told that there were no less than 8 cinemas in Barbados in the 1950s, and that this was a very common thing for teenagers to do, but Karl was out there with the Hutts, and he was primarily bird watching, but he also learned to recognize plants, spiders, and butterflies. Captain Hutt, who you can see on the right here, is remembered as one of Barbados's foremost ornithologists. He was the first bird expert to be invited onto the CITES Scientific Authority in 1994, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I'm beginning this presentation with the first interaction with Karl that I can remember. I was working towards my PhD on the Barbados green monkey, and at that time I only knew of Karl, the historian, the Barbadian historian. I only later came to know of Karl's love for the Bajan monkey. I had contacted him to find out whereabouts in Africa most enslaved people brought to the Caribbean came from. I wanted to know because the monkeys had been introduced to Barbados and St. Kitts Nevis in the same era. And if there had been more than one place of origin, it might help explain some of the subtle differences between Barbados and St. Kitts green monkeys. You can see on the left here the map of Africa, and you can see the faces of the monkeys. These are subspecies of Cercopithecus aethiops. And I learned from Karl that it was in fact possible that green monkeys had been introduced. That's the top left monkey, that's an African green monkey, as well as Tantalus monkeys, that's the bottom left monkey, and that this might explain the subtle differences between the St. Kitts green monkey, which is the top right, and the Barbados green monkey, which is the bottom right. And unless you've actually stared at monkey faces for a long time, which I have, you may not appreciate the difference, but there are differences in the forehead coloration and in the face coloration and in the pelage. He also introduced me to early naturalists writing about Barbados. Neither Smith in 1630 nor Ligon in 1657 mentioned the existence of monkeys on Barbados. But there was an act for destroying wild monkeys and raccoons which was passed in 1680. Suggesting that there were enough monkeys and raccoons on the island by then to cause significant crop damage. The act, of course, does not refer to what type of monkey, or indeed raccoon, it was. Schomburg in 1848, based on single live specimen, and he doesn't say whether it was a wild monkey or whether it was a pet monkey, suggested that the monkey in Barbados was something like a Sai or weeper monkey, which is a South American monkey, which is also known as being a crop raiding animal. And that based on the act being passed in 1680, it must have been on Barbados when the settlers arrived. From Karl, I learned that Schomburg would have only encountered South American monkeys previously, having spent a considerable amount of time in the Guyanas. and would likely not have considered that monkeys were brought more recently from Africa. No fossilized monkey bones or remains of monkeys are found in kitchen middens on Barbados, or indeed in any of the other Lesser Antillean islands. This suggests that the only species of monkey that has successfully colonized Barbados is the African green monkey, which is now known as Chlorocebus sabius and locally known as the Barbados green monkey. Karl wanted people to see that monkeys were brought here through no fault of their own and had struggled to survive alongside people for 400 years. He wanted people to see not just the crop pest, but the side of these intelligent animals that he appreciated. He often told stories on Facebook of the troop that visited his garden, and he was forever telling me stories about how the adult females, as soon as they'd given birth, they would introduce him to the new baby each year. And he was always telling me, I have photographic evidence, because he knew that as a scientist, I would be a little bit cynical about some of the things that he was saying. He was sympathetic to farmers, however, and he was very keen for them to know that the Ministry of Agriculture offered a reward for monkey tails, and that between the ministry and the Barbados Wildlife Reserve, thousands of monkeys were being removed from the island each year. He was, however, opposed to shooting monkeys because he thought it was cruel if the animal was injured and wasn't killed outright, and because of the danger that shooting poses to people. And I would second him on that. Walking my dogs in the countryside, I would be afraid if there was a lot of shooting of monkeys. I have no doubt that his recounting stories of the other side of monkeys on social media was a way to help generate a more caring attitude towards them. He recognized their value as a tourist attraction and emphasized that management of the monkey population had to be done including all stakeholders, not just farmers, not just people like him who love monkeys, or tourists, but everybody. But he certainly valued them. Karl really was a real aficionado of monkeys. Karl became editor of the Journal of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society in 1993 and continued until 2016. And I believe that this is the longest period that any editor has been in charge of the journal. He took it really seriously, and he was often thinking of next year's volume virtually as soon as the current year had appeared in print. He was aware of his readers, that they had many different interests, and the contents of the volume tended to reflect this. A feature of his period as editor was that Karl sought to include at least one paper on natural history in each volume. And many local naturalists and biologists, including Sean Carrington, Martin Frost, Wayne Burke, Angela Fields, Connor Blades, and myself, as well as visiting biologists, were invited to publish on different topics over the years. On the rare occasion that he was unsuccessful at persuading a local expert to provide an article, he himself would put pen to paper and write about unusual sightings of birds that he had heard about, or previously unrecorded plants, or any other topic that he thought would be of interest to those interested in Barbados's natural heritage. Karl himself shared a lot about the natural history of Barbados in the museum journal, whether it be from Amerindian pottery. You can see some adornos in this image, which often had faces of animals, parrots, bats, turtles. And he also included either direct translations from some of these early naturalists, or he himself wrote summaries. So from Sir Henry Colt in 1630, we learn that 1,500 pigs a week were being killed by hunters, and that's a lot of pigs. And these were introduced by the Portuguese in the 1500s. They were soon wiped out, I might add. Richard Lygon in 1648 talked about frigate birds and pelicans. He talks about the snake that climbed walls and was partial to milk. This is the native endemic grass snake, which is now extinct in Barbados, Erythrolampus perfuscus. And he also talks about the towering cabbage palms. And I think, any picture, any photograph that you see which has towering cabbage palms in, you are instantly brought to Barbados. They really are characteristic of the island. He also mentions Reverend Wilson, who who in 1933 had amassed an animal collection, and this became the foundation for the Barbados Museum. Although we're lucky to have so many accounts following colonization, and we really are, there's been a lot of natural histories written about Barbados. Karl highlighted that no one had searched the museums and archives of the Iberian Peninsula, so not enough work has been done in Spanish and Portuguese museums and archives to look for specimens and to read accounts of the things that the Portuguese would have found when they arrived in the 1500s. So this sounds to me like a very good topic for a student. Karl was best known for his interest in birds, and he was the bird expert on the CITES Scientific Authority and the Working Group on Biodiversity from 1997 until his death in January this year. CITES is an international environmental agreement that regulates trade in animals and plants between countries. It assigns species to different dependencies according to their threat, and it's the threat posed specifically by international trade, no other threat. Barbados had become a party in 1992, and one of the obligations is to form a management authority and a scientific authority. And the scientific authority provides advice on listing and any requests for imports and exports. I was invited as the reptile expert from Bellairs, as this is where the sea turtle project was at that time. Sean Carrington was invited as the plant expert, he was at UWI, and Captain Maurice Hutt was the invited bird expert. Karl succeeded Captain Hutt on the committee in 1997, when the latter retired. And I had the pleasure of working with Karl for nearly 3 decades. We were later joined by Dr. Fields, Professor Oxenford, Dr. Valles, Fiona Hines, and Carla Daniel. So when applications were made to import or export species, CITES-listed species, and bird species in particular, Karl provided his expert advice. And the early work of the committee, which was no mean feat, was the drafting of the CITES legislation, which was passed in 2006. Karl was also the bird expert on the Working Group on Biodiversity, and this provides advice on issues related to biodiversity management and conservation according to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The committee itself includes members of the scientific authority as well as members who come from various government agencies such as fisheries, coastal, vet services, soil conservation, and others. Karl's advice was sought on a variety of things. Nuisance birds in restaurants, the sugar birds, the blackbirds that were forever pecking at your plate, how they should be controlled, how to control the doves at the flour mill, how best to control egrets at the airport, and the impacts of wind turbines on birds. He himself raised concerns about grass canaries. You can see the little bird on the left-hand side at the bottom, which, despite being listed in the Wild Birds Protection Act, is often caught on glue traps and sold in pet shops. He was also concerned about the stealing of chicks from the nests of orange-winged parrots, and some were even stolen from the grounds of George Washington House, he told me. At midnight, somebody came with stun lights and a ladder and stole the chicks from the nest. He reported on sightings of new visiting species by Barbados' very active birding community. And he also often made mention of the observations in the museum journal. He was particularly thrilled if a bird species lost in the 1600s was beginning to show signs of returning, things like scaly-breasted and pearly-eyed thrashers. And he was aware of the impacts of invasive species on existing native bird species, such as the collared dove on the Zenaida dove. Collared dove is the one in the middle there at the top, and the impacts on our local Zenaida dove. But he was reluctant to acknowledge a bird species might be negatively affecting another without an abundance of proof. His major concern was for migratory shorebirds, which we'll come back to in a moment. The committee was asked to comment on importation of a variety of different animals, and one of them was donkeys. And Karl actually often lamented the decline of the donkey cart, and you can see it featured on the front cover of Barbados First. And I believe that there are only 1 or 2 donkeys left on the island. So there was some interest a little while back in importing donkeys. But to my knowledge, this has not been followed up. Barbados is not known for its abundance of resident birds today, but the geological record suggests the existence of a large rail, and a rail is the precursor to the chicken, so it looks like a fowl, it's flightless. A goose, imagine we had a goose, and a parakeet. And a parakeet would have been very similar to the parakeets which we're seeing flying around in increasing abundance at the moment. The bird life was never likely as diverse as it would have been on other Caribbean islands. Barbados's geographical isolation, the fact that it's relatively young compared to other Lesser Antillean islands, and that it has a limited range of habitats, most of which were altered or totally destroyed following colonization, meant that the island actually had very few bird species left, and only one endemic, the Barbados bullfinch, which we know locally as a sparrow, but in fact it is a finch. And of course it's very abundant. However, Barbados's somewhat isolated position makes it a favored location for passing North American migrant shorebirds on the Atlantic flyway. And you can see the flyway in the figure on the left-hand side in blue. From mid-July to late October, shorebirds pass overhead on their way to South America to overwinter. And if the weather is bad, sometimes thousands will alight on Barbados to take shelter and recharge their batteries. The bird at the bottom and the figure on the right shows lesser yellowlegs. And you can see how they're coming from northern Canada and flying down, passing over the islands on their way south. This photo illustrates the arrival of a flock of yellowlegs in bad weather. I'm mentioning this bird particularly because hundreds, if not thousands of them, are shot each year at privately run shooting swamps over a 3-month shooting season. Incidentally, this photograph is not at a shooting swamp. This is actually at a swamp where there is no shooting. As expected, Karl, like many other birders on the island, was opposed to the killing of these small, often exhausted birds, which are fully protected on their North American breeding grounds. Captain Maurice Hutt had revised the list of protected bird species on the Wild Birds Protection Act in the 1970s. The act actually didn't come out until 1985. But he listed only 4 shorebird species, and he didn't include any of the species that are shot in large numbers, like the lesser yellowlegs or the pectoral sandpipers. Not because he did not want to, but because if he had done, he felt that the amendment to the act would have been voted down. So although few in number, the hunters were highly influential. Karl was outspoken in his opposition, especially in years of bad weather when the birds were more likely to alight. Ever the advocate for the most vulnerable and helpless, he was particularly angered by the killing of the young of the year, who came in the second part of the hunting season. These birds, some still with down, baby down, were making the journey for the first time in their lives, only to be killed in a Barbados swamp. So he, as I said, these are words taken from his Facebook page. and his opposition to hunting often got him into trouble. However, Karl was also the view that hunters could make the best conservationists, and that shooting swamps also had a positive side. Some, for instance, maintain shallow water habitat outside of the shooting season, and some have become preserves. This is Woodbourne, which was ably managed by the late Wayne Doc Burke, and that makes feeding habitat available to birds year-round. Indeed, the combined swamp habitats are so important, the St. Lucie shooting swamps and the St. Philip shooting swamps are so important that jointly they're considered to be important bird areas by BirdLife International. Karl was very pleased that most swamps had agreed to work collaboratively with Environment Canada to find out what level of shooting the different species that pass over Barbados is sustainable, and that there was a move towards a reduction in harvest numbers in accordance with this scientifically based advice. However, in recent years, he was made aware that some swamps were continuing to kill birds in large numbers, and that the 16 shorebird species which have recently been placed in higher threat categories on the IUCN Red List include the lesser yellowleg, the species most often shot in Barbados. His preference was for Barbados to be a sanctuary, but in the absence of a ban, he really wanted there to be bag limits on threatened species, even if they were traditionally the target. And Karl has helped to prepare proposed amendments to the list of protected species in the schedule of the Wild Birds Act on several occasions. The actual amendment has to be done by a bill, which has to be approved by Cabinet, so it's actually quite an elaborate process. He also proposed that Barbados join the Migratory Species Convention, which would have made shooting of shorebirds illegal. However, Barbados still has not acceded to that convention. One of Karl's last posts on Facebook late last year was on the slender-billed curlew, which was officially declared extinct a few months ago. It was his way of reminding us of Barbados's notoriety as being the place where the last ever Eskimo curlew was recorded, shot at one of the shooting swamps in 1963. And as you can see, these birds, these Eskimo curlews, were being shot at rates of 2 million a year. Obviously, the Barbados swamps were not shooting anything like those numbers of birds. But it's just to make the point that these birds seem to be incredibly abundant, and yet they can be wiped out. So Karl was of the view that if the shorebird hunters of Barbados showed restraint, they had within their power to influence whether the lesser yellowleg meets a similar fate. And there's no doubt that habitat destruction and climate change are taking their toll on the breeding grounds of these birds. So this is increasing their vulnerability. And the species can still be helped to survive by protection at stopover points on their flight paths, like Barbados, or on their overwintering grounds in South America. So Karl was not opposed to development. He was very pragmatic, in fact. But he wanted to ensure that efforts were made to conserve existing bird habitat or to create new habitat to replace what had been lost. He often recognized businesses and organizations who provided new habitat for birds, whether it be large or small. So the pond at Prawn Plaza, the ponds that have been created at various golf clubs around the island, and Walker's Reserve. He was personally involved in an advisory capacity in the development of the Walker's Reserve Master Plan. Of course, he was advising on wildlife habitats and avian fauna. So these ponds, once they're planted with sedges and reeds and water lilies, and fish are placed in them, they begin to be used by waterfowl, herons, shorebirds, moorhens, ducks. He was really happy to see that people were making efforts to create habitat for bird species in the island. He was personally involved to a greater extent in Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary and Constitution River, which I'll come back to in a moment. That said, he also did not shy away from opposing development that caused harm to the natural environment. He spoke out against the removal of trees, damage to coastal swamp areas in particular, and he queried whether environmental impact assessments had been done or done adequately, and he constantly questioned whether enough thought had been given to the long-term impacts of development. He feared for the disappearance of the small West Coast swamps, a particular victim of tourist development. And one of the last messages he sent me concerned yet another concreting of a West Coast drain and its impacts on nesting sea turtles. He was particularly angered by the removal of mangrove trees from the Whole Town Lagoon. This photograph on the left is from 1930, and a recent photo taken in the last couple of years on the right. These trees were removed largely to deter roosting egrets after a nearby restaurant had built in the immediate vicinity and was complaining of feathers and droppings. It is safe to say that these small West Coast swamps are among the most endangered habitats on Barbados. I mentioned at the beginning that Karl spent a lot of time at Brighton Swamp, so he was very familiar with this area. And when the Spring Garden Highway was built, it basically bisected the swamp. And Karl followed any kind of activity that went on in this area. And he often spoke about heavy-handed destruction of vegetation. He took children there on field trips, so he was often invited by the Ministry of Environment to take children out, and he would often take them to the swamp. And he was often saddened by what he saw. He was happy to see this pond, but quite devastated to see, within a few days that every bit of vegetation had been removed from the area, including a rather nice tree. And, this befuddled Karl because he just could not understand why trees would be removed in this fashion. He also made a point of when trees were removed to build the car park, the multi-story car park in Bridgetown. Again, he was flabbergasted by the fact that you would remove trees that provided shade in Bridgetown. He was often asked to speak in defense of nature. And I don't know if you remember this silk cotton tree with its 25-foot girth. It's near Warrens, near the roundabout, and it's actually before the mosaic was built on the wall there. So this is in 2011. And there was a big discussion about this tree and whether it could be incorporated into the widening of the road. And eventually, of course, the tree was felled because it would have cost too much money to reroute the road. We did get a sandbox in the middle of the One Accord roundabout, but it really didn't replace this glorious tree. In his own unique way, Karl tried to create a care for wildlife in people. Here, he's using the wonder of the age of trees that had witnessed so much history, so much more than we could have ever witnessed in our lifetimes, to try to get people to treasure and care about these, about trees. This is a tree around the Garrison. Of course, probably know that he lived in the Garrison area. So he frequently looked at these trees. He also links the decline of trees to the decline of historic buildings, which we know is also an issue in Barbados. Karl is perhaps best known for his role in the establishment of the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary. Graham Hall Swamp is an area of very high bird, fish, and plant diversity. It's sandwiched between residential areas and the Ministry of Agriculture, and it's separated from the sea by Highway 7. It has been used in various ways over the years. It was a bird shooting swamp originally. It's been used for fishing, crabbing, for sailing miniature boats, and of course for bird watching. 115 species of birds have been recorded from Graham Hall Swamp. It's also been heavily modified, regular dredging, and the gradual closing of the above-ground connection to the sea. From the time of his visits with Captain Hutt, he often used to go to Graham Hall Swamp. He recognized the importance of the swamp for birds. And at that time, for example, it was the last breeding location for yellow warblers that we knew of in the island. It's been subject to many development concepts. A water park was even suggested at one point. But thankfully, it remains an important green space for recreation and relaxation in the very heavily built up south coast of the island. It was designated as a wetland of international importance under the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands because it's the last remaining ecosystem of its type left, the largest body of inland water on the island, the largest red mangrove and white mangrove forest. It's home to the widest diversity of resident and migratory birds on the island, and it's the site of the first known breeding colony of the little egret to become established in the Americas. So it is an incredibly important site. There are two sides to the swamp, the government side and the side that we know of as the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary. And on the government side, efforts are frequently made to manage the issues that arise with the swamp. The flooding of adjacent homes during the wet season, to control mosquitoes, to control bad smells. And this has led to efforts to manage the area. There's been periodic opening of the sluice gate. There's been building up of the banks around the trays, and the release of fish and aquatic plants into the area. Karl was very often concerned about damage being done to the shallows, which are the habitat of feeding shorebirds. On the other side, where the lake is the part that we call the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary. And the sanctuary came into being after Karl took Peter Allard into the swamp in 1994. And I think it's safe to say that Karl is the reason why the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary came into existence. The late Peter Allard was a wealthy and philanthropic Canadian who was known for contributing to the places in which he lived. Peter had read an article that Karl had written in Caribbean Weekly on the state of the wetland. Peter had read it, and he asked Karl to take him there. And with Karl's inputs, the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary was designed, and it was designed in such a way as to honor the conservation, historical, and cultural importance of the area. And the ugly duckling turned into a swan. Karl argued for complete retention of the swamp as a conservation area, but Peter Allard said, you academics, you think money grows on trees. Who's going to cover the maintenance costs of this area? So aviaries came, the interpretation center, and other facilities were all put in place at considerable expense to Mr. Allard. Then in 2003, the sewage plant was constructed on the northeast side of the swamp. And this led to rising tensions whenever there was a spill. Peter Allard was bitterly disappointed with what he perceived as a lack of support for his favorite Barbadian investment. And of course, this led to the lawsuits and closure of the swamp eventually. One lawsuit went to the International Court of Arbitration in New York in 2010. And what some may not know is that Karl was a witness for the government of Barbados, not for Peter Allard. Karl probably felt that the lawsuit could have been a serious threat to government's long-term support for conservation of the swamp. And this was, after all, what Karl was actually fighting for. After the Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary was closed, that side of the swamp basically became off limits. But Karl continued to visit the government side and raised concerns about the water levels in the swamp, any overgrowth in the shallow water trays, and anything he perceived as heavy-handed action within the swamp area. The announcement that Graham Hall Nature Sanctuary was purchased by Anthony de Silva and was to reopen was announced in the media on January the 9th, 2025, just 2 days before Karl died. I'd like to think that he was aware of this. because it would have made him very happy. The Barbados Wetlands Trust, this is a new organization, is going to take control of managing the sanctuary as a national asset dedicated to nature conservation, community engagement, and sustainable ecotourism. Barbados was not the only beneficiary of Peter Allard's philanthropy. Thanks to Karl also encouraged him to invest in Dominica's wildlife. The two of them flew to Dominica, and this visit led to Allard acquiring a large acreage of elfin and rainforest in the Morne Diablotin area. This is in the northwest side of the island. This he donated to establish the Morne Diablotin National Reserve's Syndicate Parrot Preserve, primarily to protect this high-altitude elfin forest habitat, which was utilized by the imperial parrot, or Cicero, which is the national bird of Dominica. The other wetland area where Karl really left his mark was on the Constitution River. Here it is in 1870. The river drained a large watershed, St. Michael, St. Thomas, and St. George, good-sized areas in these parishes, and it was navigable as far as the Globe Roundabout. The delta contained mangrove swamps from Needham's Point all the way to Brighton Beach, more or less continuously, and these swamps were feeding grounds for migratory birds and home habitat for fish. Steadily, as Bridgetown developed, the swamps were drained and filled in, and in the 1960s, the river was canalized to reduce flooding and mosquito-borne diseases. A new project, beautification of Constitution River, began in 2013, and it involved dredging and deepening this canal, the canal of the river, by 6 feet to permit seawater to flow into the inlet. I always get nervous when I see that word, beautification, because you never know quite what's going to happen, but it always suggests to me that it's going to be very orderly and tidy at the end. And indeed, the banks have been built up with rocks, and it's been attractively landscaped, and it's in keeping with national heritage objectives, not natural heritage, but certainly national heritage objectives. Karl felt that an opportunity had been missed to create a true urban wetland, something like the London Wetland Centre, if you've ever been there. You know, he felt that the opportunity had been missed when the river was dredged, because when you dredge it, you get rid of the shallow water habitat, which is so valuable for shorebirds, for instance, as feeding habitat. And there were some interesting birds that were utilizing that area. And then, so it became too deep for the birds to feed. So Karl had actually wanted some of the shallow water habitat to remain. And you can see the type of habitat that he was hoping to keep on the right-hand side. You can see it very overgrown on the left-hand side. But he was hoping that it would not all be a rock boundary and deep water, but there would be mudflats for the birds. Fortunately, Kevin Talma was the landscape designer on this project, and he consulted extensively with Karl on planting of red and white mangroves on the rock banks. Remember, there did used to be these mangroves in the Constitution River. Indeed, there used to be a black mangrove also in the river delta. Karl endorsed this idea wholeheartedly. It gave him great pleasure to see how the white mangroves were thriving near to the Globe Roundabout and the more salt-tolerant red mangroves close to the bus terminal. But he still lamented the fact that there was no shallow water habitat for the shorebirds. Finally, I want to talk about Karl's particular passion for two groups of marine animals. First, the marine mammals that visited the region. Like monkeys and dogs, he recognized these as sentient creatures, capable of sophisticated behaviors, and like his migratory birds, he was awed by the distance that they traveled to spend the winter in Caribbean waters. And you can see how the humpback population that comes down to our region comes down from Iceland, Greenland, northern Canada. So they feed there in the summer months, and then when it gets cold up there, they come down south, and they often give birth, particularly in the Silver Bank in Dominican Republic, and some of them stray down even further south. And Karl often promoted the idea for ecotourism. We're seeing humpbacks more regularly, they're more abundant, and he felt that ecotourism was a way forward. He often spoke of sightings at Animal Flower Cave, for example. He abhorred the killing of whales and dolphins in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. He shared many posts on Facebook. I counted them, I think there were 25. And many of them related to the humpback hunts in Bequia. But he also occasionally let loose on the Faroe Islands, Iceland, and Japan. They were often in his sights too. He was particularly angered about arguments put forward to justify the kill. He challenged the notion that it was traditional, and traditional in the sense of the International Whaling Commission's idea of traditional. There's no doubt that smaller cetaceans have been hunted in the Caribbean for thousands of years, but whaling of great whales is actually a relatively recent activity. It was started by William Wallace in the 1860s. He learnt the trade from American whalers. He came back, he bought 2 whaleboats, and he built a shore station on Bequia. Karl was angry because he felt that the whales that we were enjoying watching, would very likely end up being killed. And, his feeling was about the killing of these animals. He felt that the way that they were killed was extremely cruel. He didn't imply that it was illegal, because it's not illegal. Bequia has an annual legal quota of 4 humpbacks a year. They're not supposed to take mothers with calves, which that is one of the things that they're not allowed to do. But they are allowed to take 4 humpbacks, up to 4 humpbacks a year, and they usually don't take as many in a given year. There's also a thriving small cetacean or smaller cetacean harvest on St. Vincent itself at Barralee. And it's mainly pilot whales, but also includes dolphins, more or less any marine mammals that are found in their waters. And occasionally orcas or killer whales would be taken. And Karl would have been very happy to hear that the bagger whalers, these are the whalers that come from Barralee and St. Vincent, have voluntarily agreed to stop killing orcas. We've been very happy to hear that. The second group are the sea turtles. In 2000, Karl had gone to assist a leatherback turtle that was attempting to nest on Browns Beach. He'd actually been called by the police. I think they'd called the hotline and had not been able to get through, or they'd got the answer phone and they were concerned. This policeman knew Karl and they called him. He went down to see if he could help. She had been struck over the head several times and was gravely injured. She was walking round and round in circles and was attempting to get back into the sea. Killing nesting turtles had been illegal since the early 1900s, and Karl railed against the criminal-minded individuals who were so cruel in their treatment of this helpless animal. Again, he had a real preponderance for protection of helpless and vulnerable animals. It left a very lasting impression on Karl, and for the next 25 years, Karl was a staunch friend of the Barbados Sea Turtle Project. First while I was in charge, and in later years when Carla Daniel took over. He frequently reposted her posts and videos on Facebook, and regularly asked that anyone so moved should support the Sea Turtle Project either financially or as a volunteer. Karl made his last post in support of the Sea Turtle Project in late November, just a few weeks before his passing. I want to finish with these 2 comments from Karl, in which he reminds us that we must now put our efforts into fighting to protect the east and the north coasts from overdevelopment. Development has begun, and if we do not take whatever action we can to protect these areas, they too will soon be gone. He also reminds us of, sadly, our very poor track record in conservation. He actually, he did frequently praise the Sea Turtle Project, and I'm only saying that because he did that publicly on Facebook for the work in conservation of sea turtles. But he always felt that we could do more, that we need to step up and be good stewards of Barbados's remaining species and ecosystems. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Professor Horrocks for this very moving presentation about Karl's various efforts with regard to the natural history, the natural wildlife of Barbados. It was in a few places a bit depressing and disturbing, I'm afraid. I think for all of us, anyone who is a supporter of the preservation of our natural history and natural heritage is sometimes very disheartened when we see what our fellow man can do and what Karl fought against. At this time, we'd like to open the floor for questions. Before we get started, I would just like to remind everyone that you do need to ask your question into the microphone so those who are following on Facebook and on other social media platforms can hear the question asked. Do we have any questions at this time?
Hi, Professor. I'm Mark Fiorentino. I live up on the east coast of the U.S. near Philadelphia. Would you mind moving to your map of migratory birds? I was wondering because southern New Jersey is a stopover for a lot of migratory birds, Cape May in particular. I was trying to spot whether there are any bird species that visit our area that have flown north from Barbados.
This was the one you meant.
Yeah.
You would have to point out to me exactly where Philadelphia is on that map. And this is a generalized map of migratory birds flying down. It's not just the lesser yellow legs are shown in the diagram on the right-hand side. Florida, yeah.
South Carolina, North Carolina,
Yeah.
Virginia,
Yeah.
Maryland, Pennsylvania.
Yeah. Well, it looks to me as though, yes, you could be a stopover point. You may be a little bit, well, it depends what kind of habitat you've got. These birds stop over at usually shallow water habitat where they can feed and rest. So if you have that habitat and if it's warm enough, they may well stop over.
I actually have a question. How accessible is the government side for general persons in the population if they wanted to go see the swamp and were not necessarily minded to wait for the privately owned section to reopen?
You can go into the government side of the swamp. We went in there actually fairly recently. It's become a little bit overgrown, so you would have to wear Wellington boots at the very least. But yeah, I mean, still large portions of the swamp on the government side are accessible.
And we wouldn't be trespassing. It's quite
No,
okay.
government owned.
Good to know.
Yeah.
I've only ever gone in on the sanctuary side, so I was one of those people that was very, very upset when it closed.
Yes.
We went several times a year. My daughter practically grew up there.
Mm-hmm.
So I was never aware you could get there any other way.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
It's not really a question, but I want to thank you, Julia, for sharing your impressions of Karl's work. And I was very happy that you agreed to do this lecture. I know it must have been quite emotional trying to go through his Facebook page. I just wanted people to know that before he passed away, one of our conversations, the work that he was most proud of all the government work that he ever did, was with the CITES Convention. He said that that was the work that he was the most proud of. So I just wanted to note that, just so that's there for the historical record, that he was most proud of all the government work he did: foreign affairs, tourism, culture. His work with the CITES Convention was the most important to him.
Thanks, Tara. That's very good to know. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments?
Yes, Julie. Not really about Karl, but you mentioned Captain Hutt, as his mentor. And I just wondered if you also recall this story, and Jeff, as president of the trust, might be able to confirm this, that poor Captain Hutt was kind of voted off the Council of the National Trust because of his kind of opposition to shooting. Do you recall hearing that story, or?
I certainly do recall hearing it. Yeah, it was a little before my time, but I do remember hearing it.
I must confess I don't remember that, Sean. And it might have happened when I took a break off the Council of the Trust. So I have to go with your recollection.
Just as a point of interest, you mentioned that the environmental impact research for the buildings of Barbados, and he was concerned about that. Who in Barbados is responsible for the monitoring of environmental research before buildings?
If I heard you right, you were asking about who is responsible for the EIAs, the environmental impact assessments. They are usually requested by the planning department for new developments. I was talking specifically there about EIAs in sensitive areas where there was a risk to species or ecosystems, and Karl was very interested in ensuring that adequate EIAs were done to look at what the impacts would be of the development and how developmental impacts could be mitigated. But yes, it's the planning department, I believe.
Well, in which case, I'd like to thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for your questions, which have been quite interesting thus far. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Professor Horrocks for delivering a really very interesting lecture, a very interesting talk this evening. Karl's activities were quite wide-ranging and extensive with regard to protecting and safeguarding the natural heritage of Barbados, and I think she's done an absolutely wonderful job of giving a kind of an overview of how far-ranging and how effective his contributions were, and we'd like to very much thank you for that. I'd also like to thank you all for coming in support of this series, this very important series. Karl's contributions have been across a quite wide range of interests, as we are discovering as the series progresses. He was a real Barbadian with the interests of Barbados at heart in many different areas, as we're beginning to see. So the picture that is emerging is becoming ever more complex and intriguing as each lecture passes. I'd like to therefore invite you back for the 16th of the month, when we'll be hearing about his diplomatic exploits, which I'm sure, well, I've heard a few little tidbits myself, which are quite exciting and quite intriguing in places. So we look forward to having you there. And if you will just give us a moment or two to get things wrapped up, we'll invite you to have just some quick refreshments at the back of the theatre. Thank you so much, everyone.